The arrogant teacher thought she was humiliating a black boy, but the boy corrected her in math. It was a sunny spring morning, the kind of morning that seemed to intoxicate the air with a new freshness and promised energy. However, inside the Jean-Paul Sartre High School, an establishment renowned for its modern teaching methods and its supposedly open-minded teachers, a particular climate persisted. The one where innovative ideas often clashed with old practices, those which maintain invisible but very present structures, woven with judgments and injustices. The mathematics class of Ms. Lefebvre, a teacher in her 50s, was a place of routine and conformity, where intellectual brilliance was often confined to a few students with model behavior, conformists and, above all, accepted. Today's lesson seemed quite mundane: quadratic equations, a subject that students should master without too much difficulty. However, the atmosphere in the room denoted something else: an insidious weariness, a general detachment from the subject, and, above all, an approach that never called into question the expectations placed on the students. Some, distracted, were already daydreaming about the break. Others were desperately looking for an escape in their phone or their thoughts. But that would all change that day, because today it wouldn't just be another class. Today was a moment of truth, not only for Ms. Lefebvre, but also for one of her students, Malik. Malik was a young black boy, slender and calm, with a posture that was both discreet and full of dignity. Behind his calm gaze, we guessed a sharp intelligence, a thirst for learning that was not content with easy answers. His father, a respected but humble man, a former worker turned craftsman, had always encouraged him to never let the prejudices of others bring him down. "Don't let anyone define your worth, Malik," he often told her. But at school, Malik had always been considered the different student, the one who was underestimated, who was believed to be incapable of shining in subjects considered complex, and above all, the one who was not expected to excel. At school, as in many other places, the view of Malik was never neutral. Racial stereotypes, invisible but oppressive, had shaped the expectations of his teachers and peers about him. He was often seen as someone who would just go with the flow, without ever standing out. Although, in reality, he was one of the brightest students in the class. Ms. Lefebvre, for her part, perfectly represented this type of teacher whose authority was nourished by the conformism of others. His stern gaze and haughty attitude denoted a constant desire to maintain order and respect through fear, but also a worldview closed to nuance. She seemed to pay more attention to her white students, who were often more behaved, or polite, by her personal standards. Malik, with his African features and frizzy hair, was to her just another teenager whose intellect was perhaps not worth exploring. When he raised his hand to respond, she often ignored him or made condescending remarks, as if his upbringing or his origin made his answers less credible. That morning, when the students were already feeling heavy with fatigue and weariness with mathematics, Ms. Lefebvre decided to improvise a little exercise. She drew an equation on the board.
2x2 más 5x 3 igual a 0 2x acento circunflejo 2 más 5x 3 igual a 0 2x 2 más 5x 3 igual a 0.
It seemed simple. But for her, it was an opportunity to put her students to the test, and perhaps more importantly, to drive another point home in her view of Malik. Glancing around the room, her eyes landed on him, like a hunter spotting her prey. She knew he wouldn't dare answer, or worse, he would give a hesitant answer, like so many others before. She expected hesitation. She was expecting an error. She was, in a way, waiting for confirmation of her prejudices. The students remained silent, some uncomfortable with the numbers, others completely lost in thought. Malik was looking at the equation, his mind already working on the solutions. He was in his element. He knew how to approach this kind of problem. No mystery, just method. Mathematics was one of the few fields where he never felt this weight of being different. The numbers made no distinction, the equations did not judge. But what surprised him was the way Madame Lefebvre suddenly moved towards him, her smile displaying a sort of challenge. She knew what she was doing. She thought that this little moment could be an opportunity to further drive home the idea that, despite his brilliance, Malik was not cut out to be at the top. She asked the question sarcastically. "Malik, maybe you want to try solving this equation?" She didn't expect a quick response, nor a correct answer. She thought he would get lost in uncertain explanations, as she had seen with so many others. The gaze of his comrades turned to Malik, curious to see how he would react. A heavy silence fell over the room, everyone scrutinizing this suspended moment. For Malik, it was not a matter of pride, but of dignity. He took a deep breath. He knew what was at stake. It wasn't just a simple equation. It was a test of his skills, but also of the expectations placed on him as a young black man in that classroom. He could feel the weight of this expectation, the idea that his answer would be judged, not only by his understanding of mathematics, but also by the color of his skin. However, he was not intimidated. He knew that mathematics did not take prejudices into account. There was no room for stereotypes in formulas and equations. All that mattered was logic and method. Without another word, he stood up calmly, his eyes still fixed on the equation. Then, with a determined step, he headed towards the painting under the curious looks of his comrades, and under the increasingly worried gaze of Madame Lefebvre. She didn't expect that. She thought that this moment would reveal her weakness, but it was she who would find herself destabilized by her students' accuracy. First, we need to identify the coefficients, he began confidently, his voice calm but firm, filled with the quiet authority he had been able to impose in the class. Here, A equals 2, B equals 5, and C equals -3. We will use the discriminate formula to solve this equation. With meticulous precision, he traced the symbols on the board, his gestures measured, as if he were painting the foundations of irrefutable logical reasoning. The blackboard became his playground, and the class, his attentive audience. He wrote the formula carefully, underlining it with a fluid gesture.
Igual a B2 4AC barra inversa delta igual a B acento circunflejo 2, 4AC igual a B2 4AC.
His students' eyes shone with curiosity, each gesture seemed calculated, each word chosen to guide them step by step towards understanding. Malik was not just a teacher, he was a master of reasoning, an architect of minds. He continued without haste, his calm and almost educational tone. Now we replace the values in the formula.
SO, delta pende dio, tessera times dio times, tria.
His fingers slid across the board to highlight each component, emphasizing each detail, each step of the equation. He stopped for a moment, scanning the students, measuring the impact of his words. That gives delta equals 25 plus 24, he said affirmatively, and continued with absolute clarity. Delta equals 49. The students watched, fascinated, some frantically taking notes, others concentrating so intently you could hear a pin drop. Malik smiled inwardly, sure of himself. He knew the solution would now be obvious. The foundations were laid, the path traced. The equation just had to unfold naturally. He continued, his pace relentless. Since delta is 0, the equation has two distinct roots. We will calculate them using the following formula, he explained, drawing a new equation masterfully on the board. XB delta dio ax frac, BPM skirti delta, dio A x dio A B delta. The students hung on his lips, some murmuring the formula under their breath, as if to reassure themselves that they were following the reasoning. He guided them without haste, like a conductor leading his ensemble to the rhythm of a complex but magnificent melody. What gives? He said at last calmly.
X igual a 5 más menos 494, X igual a barra inversa frac, menos 5 barra inversa pi en barra inversa SQRT, 49, 4. X igual a 4 5 más menos 49.
He took a moment to make sure everyone was okay with him before continuing. So x equals \frac dash 5 plus 7, 4, equals \frac 2, 4, equals 0.5, he explained with precision that left no room for error. Then he continued as calm as ever. And x equals \frac dash 5, 7, 4, equals \frac dash 12, 4, equals -3. A heavy silence fell in the room. It was not a silence of doubt, but of respect. Each student seemed to digest not only the mathematical reasoning, but also Malik's quiet ability to solve the equation with disconcerting ease. Malik then turned to Ms. Lefebvre, who seemed unsettled, and added, with a barely perceptible smile, but full of meaning, "And there you have it. The solutions are x equals 0.5 and x equals -3. He looked at her, his eyes filled with calm and certainty. It was as if he was giving her a silent challenge. What else could she say after that? The silence in the class was heavy, dense, imbued with palpable tension.
No noise, no maquerie, no questions.
The students were amazed, not only by Malik's speed, but also by the way in which he had swept aside Ms. Lefebvre's attempts to destabilize in one fell swoop. They were witnessing a pure display of skill, and what they saw was way beyond mathematics. Malik, with a confident look, slowly returned to his place. The challenge was met, and there was nothing more to add. Ms. Lefebvre, for her part, was visibly embarrassed. The audacity she had imagined to publicly fail him was now transformed into an uncomfortable humility. She had not anticipated such a precise, clear, irrefutable answer. She stood up, her lips tight, aware that the image she projected of authority had just cracked. A murmur passed through the room, a faint but meaningful echo, as the students began to look at each other, aware of the injustice that Malik had just disarmed with his simple skill. Eyes met, some filled with admiration, others tinged with gratitude towards the one who, without raising his voice, without seeking confrontation, had known how to masterfully disarm judgment. It was not just a question of mathematics, but of dignity, of self-confidence, and of a justice which, in this precise context, finally seemed to be restored. After a moment of silence that seemed to stretch into infinity, Ms. Lefebvre sat up straight in her chair, trying to regain her authority, as if the rules of the class were suddenly shaken by what she had just experienced. "Well, Malik," she began in an almost cold voice, a voice she had carefully prepared to mask her frustration and confusion, "it seems that you have mastered the method well." Her words were carefully chosen, but the irony in her voice betrayed the impatience she felt. She found it difficult to accept that a student she had underestimated, perhaps because of his appearance, his background, or his initial behavior, had not only exceeded her expectations, but had done so with such ease that she could only respond with words devoid of warmth. It was obvious that what she had mistaken for carelessness or rebellion in Malik was really just a silent confidence in his own abilities. She wished she could go back, erase her preconceived thoughts, but the reality was there. Malik had taken the lead, and she was now faced with the obvious. It was a moment she couldn't easily erase. Shame began to set in, not in the sense of personal humiliation, but in the feeling that she had just made a fundamental mistake. The form she had imposed in the classroom, that of a dominant and unwavering teacher, wavered in the face of the quiet strength of Malik, who had never allowed himself to be disturbed. Malik did not seek to humiliate anyone. He did not want to make this moment a demonstration of his superiority, nor an opportunity to take revenge for a perceived injustice. For him, victory was not in the eyes of a destabilized teacher, but in the fact of having gone through an ordeal which, although academic, resonated much more deeply. It was a small victory, perhaps insignificant to some, but significant in the world in which he lived. He knew, without saying it, that this success was not simply a personal conquest, but a silent act against the stereotypes and expectations often placed on him because of his skin color and his origin. It was an invisible challenge, a daily struggle, to prove that he was much more than what some saw on the outside. From that day on, something had changed. Students began to see him differently, but not just because of his math brilliance. What had changed was their overall perception of him. They had seen a young man who was calm, confident, and able to remain in control in the face of adversity that had nothing to do with the equations he was solving. Malik was no longer just another student. He had become a model of dignity and competence. A murmur circulated among the students, a silent but palpable respect that could no longer be ignored. He had gained something more valuable than a grade or external validation. He had won their recognition. As for Ms. Lefebvre, she was faced with a larger dilemma than simply correcting an academic error. She understood that her judgment had been hasty and erroneous. What she had perceived as arrogance, insubordination, or a form of distrust in Malik was in reality a deep self-confidence, a tacit respect for learning, even if she had not been able to see it before. This moment of vulnerability, although discreet, marked a decisive turning point in the way he perceived his student. She was now forced to question her own prejudices, her skewed expectations, and her role in maintaining these stereotypes. There was no longer any room for ignorance. For Malik, this moment was more than just solving an equation. It represented a victory against a larger system, one that tended to underestimate those who came from certain neighborhoods, certain backgrounds, or who were perceived as different. By proving his worth in an indisputable manner, he had demonstrated, not only to Madame Lefebvre, but to everyone who looked at him, that true intelligence knows neither color nor prejudice. He did not need to shout his legitimacy, because he had inscribed it in the simplicity of his response, in the tranquility of his mind. This moment, although intangible and difficult to measure in its entirety, marked a turning point in how other students saw her and how he saw himself. Malik understood that, beyond the equation, he had just won a deeper battle, a battle for recognition, for equality, and for the integrity of his own identity. One equation at a time, he proved that he was not defined by the expectations of others, but by his own abilities and inner courage.